everybody. It's great to see a good crowd for a combined session on the Pariser Gespräche, which is both a session for the paper 4, historical linguistics, and for the Old High German paper. The historical linguistics topic is forms of address, and so we thought it's appropriate to do it in dialogue. I'm very grateful to Howard Jones for coming and keeping me on the straight and narrow when it comes to linguistics. We are well-oiled dual act. It's one of two sessions that we'll do jointly. The next one will be on the transition from Old High German to Middle High German. And for the forms of address, I thought I would start today with a historic object. As you know, I like the materiality of the archives. This is a little notebook entitled Excerpte by Hermann Fiedler, who was a professor of German between 1907 and 1937. Here you can see his bust outside. And these are his lecture notes for his lectures on Old High German. Mixed in are the notes he took to record what probably was one of the earliest conversation guides for English learners to be recorded. So he recorded it on the first wax cylinders, and it was transferred to these small, we haven't completely agreed how these were called, the 33 millimeters or whatsoever recordings. And these are very practical conversation guides which stand in a line with the Pariser Gespräche that we are discussing today, and are in a way a forerunner of Duolingo in this trying to teach it in real life situation and interactive. So the Pariser Gespräche are really rare case of being able to trace some orality, and that can be situated, and Howard will do that later, very precisely geographically through the spelling and historically in a language contact situation. Quite relevant for you as learners of German studying how language learning has been done through the ages. So the way we are going to run the session is that I'm responsible for the big sweep, starting in the earliest periods and going once through to the 21st century with in a whistle-stop tour, but with a historic cultural stop at the Pariser Gespräche, and then Howard will return to the Pariser Gespräche to do a more in-depth linguistic analysis. So in the Germanic times, you only have the du, the second person singular as form of address, and that survives, for example, in the use of the Our Father, because God is addressed always in the intimate familiar form. Vater uns im Himmel, geheiligt werde dein Name. And so the thou art in heaven of the old form of the Our Father is the old familiar form, and what is used in the modern usage, you are, is in a way the formal form of address which just became adopted when English switched over to going to the plural form. So currently you are all using a formal form of address to everybody rather than the old familiar Germanic du. An exception, Howard, I haven't been able to clear up is that Dutch apparently uses ihr in the Vater Unser in Dutch. Henk de Berg, who was giving the lecture last week and with whom I discussed forms of address, said that in Dutch, God is the only person being addressed now in the plural after a Dootsreform in Dutch. So that's something perhaps to look later in. But in all the other Germanic languages, it's the familiar form used also for God throughout the history. And the first attested use of the plural in form of address, the ihr, comes in learned context. So in the preface addressed to the Bishop Salomo of Konstanz by Ottfried von Weissenburg in his Evangelienbuch, you see the beautiful laid out manuscript, which has the composition. If you read down the red initials here, you can see it has an akrostichon, Salomon. It has also a telestichon. Every line ends with the same letter it has started, so the last letters also form Salomon. And Salomon is here addressed, Lecza ich derara burche iosento in swabo richi, dass ihr kiaset überall, aber sie auf frumma wesansral. Aber ihr hier findet ihr wicht das würdig ist, das Lesenes, that is, which is worthy to read, würdig des Lesens ist. And this comes from an ecclesiastical use of addressing clergy as sign of their status in the plural. And just as a side note, because that's what I'm currently working on, the northern German nuns, they are visited by Bishop Berthold of Landsberg, the Bishop of Verden and Bremen, and he tells them that he is not happy that they are using the familiar form when addressing each other. And he says, Item, cum Paulus jubeat ut honore nos prevenire debeamus, volumus ut non lait cali more sorores se nominent, sed latino mater, vel soror Gertrudis, vel Althadelheides, et Elisabeth, nec se in futurum tibisent. So tibisare, to tibi dative of to, so they shouldn't use the do form among each other. So that is the background of the introduction, and you have this, which is also linked to the pluralis majestatis, so the Pope issuing decrees in the first person plural and being addressed, or you know it then also from royalty, we are not amused, and so on. So because the person stands for an institution, so doesn't speak on their own authority, but of that of wider context. While in secular texts, so in the Hildebrandslied, even though Hildebrand and Hardubrand don't know that they are related, so they can't claim familiarity, they still immediately use the du. So there is no starting on a formal level, on a lay level, and that's also why the bishop said not like lay people like these, they should use it. So Hildebrand challenges the son and says, tell me from which family you are coming, edo welches Knursles du siehst. ibe du mir enan sages, ik mi die odre weet, kind in Koninkriche, kut es mir al irmindeot. So the second person singular. And the interesting case with the Pariser Gespräche is that you have a mixed use of ihr and du in one dialogue. Now, this dialogue isn't laid out as you would see it in your modern textbook or in printed or online form but it's really a marginal entry. So you see the main text is an alphabetical index of difficult Latin words that are glossed with better known Latin words. So it's a Latin glossary. And in the lighter brown ink, you have these entries here. Chorus tu narra, for example, here where my cursor is. So it's really an informal way of noting down, not written by a learned scribe for copying out, but as an aide-memoire, as it were. The original manuscript is split into parts, so folio 50 verso is now in the Bibliotheca Vaticana, and the bulk of the manuscript with these Pariser Gespräche on 1 recto, 2 verso, and 3 recto in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And I'll just go through a few examples of these questions and answers. And they are really reminiscent partly of Duolingo, also absurd phrases, particularly, of course, number 3, undes ars in tine naso, it est canis culum in tuo naso. So, and you'll, on your handout, you'll have, not to look at now, but Howard Jones has back translated in proper Old High German these forms. So undes obviously is what we would in normal Old High German and modern German would be Hund, the canis and Hund being the same word, yeah. So this is the singular form. So in thou, in thine nose. Similarly, chorus tu narra. If only you were to listen, kind of pay attention now, you stupid, you fool, you narr. We just had the närrische Tage, the Fastnacht, on Monday and Tuesday. This is in contrast to phrases like what queten jel era like Herr, and queten like quedan, to say. There's always the Latin equivalent with the I for it est. That means quid dicitis vos. So the Latin equivalent makes it also clear that this is the plural form. So it's second person plural. and that corresponds to addressing a higher ranked person, so the Herr, the Lord, or Sir, in contrast to the fool or the person who has the doxars wished upon their nose. The fourth sentence, which I've extracted here, again has clearly linked to a high status, high profile case. Tränket je Guale in Gottes Minne, in aller Gottes Heiligen, Mine Sancte Maria, Frau underer Huer, Mine, under höher Minne. It est bibite in Dei amore Sancte Mariae me, et in ea vestra. So this is a kind of toast that you would serve. In the Middle High German period, you have the Johannes Minne trinken, for example, where you would, in this name of St. John, have a friendship cup shared, and you would have a holy toast linked to it. Over to you for this slide.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out one thing, which is that it looks from the examples that you were just going through in the Pariser Gespräche as if there was a status-based distinction between the du form and the ihr form. But elsewhere in the Pariser Gespräche, you don't find that so much. So here I've noted down at the end, in 64 and 65, the exchange that we just saw, so guas queten ye era, and then gehoris du nara, so this is 64 and 65 on the handout actually. But if you look at the exchange before that, I don't think you'd necessarily say that the ear form was being used for high status or for respect. So if you look at 60, so Cuando na guarin ye sa metina means why were you not at matins? And there you have guarin ye, which in Old High German will be waret ear, and in Middle High German will be waret ear. And that is the ear form being used in a familiar context. And importantly, it's a departure from the Latin, because the Latin is fuisti, which is the tu form. Okay. 61, en walde, so ich nie Walter, ich ne Walder, Middle High German. And then we've got 62, je in skleffen bit te whip, or weep, in order better. You, I think it's meant to mean were sleeping, but it seems as if the tense used here is the present. You are sleeping in with the woman in your bed. And again, we've got the ear forms of the verb, je en skleffen, and of the possessive, ora, meaning ura. And that's against the Latin, tu jacuisti, and then tuo lecto. So I won't go through the next.
But couldn't it be that this is actually this interesting case where status and situation are against each other? Because you would expect a clergy member of the clergy to have to go to matins, but you wouldn't expect a member of the clergy to oversleep. And the same, it only becomes a problem to sleep with a woman in the bed if you are meant to be celibate. So, yeah.
Yeah, it could be. I was going to make a slightly more mundane point, which is that in the example that you went through, where we do find this status-based correlation between the use of do and the use of ear, in that case, the Old High German followed the Latin.
Yeah.
Okay. And you could argue in that case, well, it's just slavish imitation of the Latin. But here, you have departures from the Latin, which suggests to me that the ear form as some second person pronoun of address was native, rather than just being an imitation of the Latin.
Yeah, I completely take your point in that.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll run very quickly through the developments of the next 1,000 years. So there is the ear increasingly being used for single addressees, particularly in formal high status writing, but it remains use are based on the situation. So in modern German, particularly important for the second years who are still to go on their year abroad, it's impossible to withdraw from a do once you have gone over from, you start on the formal and there are certain conditions and situation in which you switch to the do. The advice to translators, at least 20 years ago, when translating from English into German novels was, you switch from sie to du after the first kiss, because then you can't assume that they continue to say sie in a German context. This has somehow shifted, but the trajectory in 21st century German is an irreversible transition from the formal to the informal, and that is depending on many more variables and is can be reverted and can also be expressed in the same text differently according to the use from a different scribe in a different dialect region, according to a different audience. So this is a survey of dialogue in the Nibelungenlied done by Horst Simon, who did the lecture on forms of address, which is also on Canvas, so you can look at in more detail at that, who compared different manuscripts for the same dialogue between Siegfried and Gunther, and those who do paper 9 know how important it is to determine exactly which of the two has the higher status, because that is how all the bloodshed starts, so that Brünnhilde believes Siegfried to be of a lower status at Gunther, at that Kriemhild rebuts this claim. So you can see here it goes between ear and do back and forth at different points in the same dialogue. But it's always clear that the ear is the more respectful one, the tendency is to use it between high status figures, and du is the familiar one, but on a scale. So again, in the earlier lecture, we've spoken about it in more detail. There is the situation between the two brothers, Feirefitz, who is the son of Garmuret's liaison with Belakane, and then Parzival, who is the son of Garmuret and Herzeleude. They recognize each other after having been raised in different countries and continents. And Feirefitz is overjoyed and says, Jupiter hat seinen Vlies, wer der Held gelecket an dich, du sollt nicht mehr irzen mich, wir hätten beide doch einen Vater. So you should no longer call me with ihr, the formal form of address, the plural form, because we both had the same father. Mit bruderlichen Trühen bat dass irzens ihn erlierse und ihn duzen lieche hierse. And so he asked him to stop using the formal ihr and address him with a familiar du. Du redde was Parzivale leid, der sprach, Bruder, ür Riechheit geliechet wohl dem Baruke sich, so sieht ihr älter auch denn ich, min Jugend und min Armut soll solcher Losheit sin behurt. So, Parzival names 3 categories that prevent him from using the familiar form of address. 2, just qualified further. So the first is the wealth or status with reich, meaning both rich and powerful. Feirewitz has these fabulous Oriental riches like the Baruch, the Oriental ruler, and he's also older. So status and age are determining factor, as are still the case in modern German. Ihr, sie und du, rather than in English. So that should stop him using such Losheit. Losheit means kind of evil way of speaking, to have a loose tongue, to be so free and liberal in conversation as to use the second person singular. Dass ich ü duzen bierte, wenn ich mich züchtenierte. So he continues to use the ü, second person plural, and not go over to the duzen. This is the situation that you will see in Helmbrecht, where you have the switching between irzen and duzen, depending on how Helmbrecht himself styles to be, whether he claims to belong to the court or whether he comes home to his father and his father doesn't know whether still to call him by the familiar du or to go over to the courtly ihr. And the Sendbrief vom Dolmetsch and the other set text, you have Luther addressing his friend Lazarus Spengler with a formal form of address to mark the status of the addressee as a learned clerk to the town council. And you have then the Titelbüchlein in the 16th century that would tell you exactly which titles to use to address whom. The situation starts to diversify in the late 16th century, when ihr had become so omnipresent that it no longer worked as a distinguishing feature to pay respect, because everybody was called by the ihr. So the introduction of und sie to refer is a further development. this is used on the grammatical basis. So here, the gnädige Fräulein is called with a er rather than with a sie. I'll skip most of that. You can look it up in Horst Simon's lecture, or also in the lecture notes by Howard Jones from his previous lectures. It becomes more twisted towards the Sie as generic form of address for the formal point. And then in the 19th century, it settles on the system that we know of just having du und sie as formal versus informal form. But normally it's used on a symmetrical basis, not on an asymmetric use of du and sie. It's only now in school context, so teachers will call children up to age 16 or up to the Hauptschulabschluss as with du while being addressed as sie. After that, in the sixth form, also the students are addressed with sie because they are of the age where they could be working. You use it towards all adults. We also don't have really time to look at the difference in development between West and East, which is very interesting to note because there are different drivers for expanding the du area. So in West Germany, it's the 68 student revolution, but also the large influx of workforce from abroad. So the Turkish migrant workers using then du, Untertage, so the minors, among each other, while in East Germany, du is used as the socialist Bruder, du, and expands in that sense, but leads to a kind of backlash that intellectuals who want to mark that they aren't part of the party use deliberately sie as a distancing feature, not among themselves, but to mark their distance from the party who is stylizing itself as representing Arbeiter- und Bauernstaat. So my theory, even though I haven't the whole data at hand, is that Germany is the only Germanic country to keep the du-sie distinction is due to this East-West different developments, and that it's part of West German takeover that the sie is preserved while you have a Duz-reform in all of Scandinavia and in the Netherlands. And England has its own development with a formal form of address taking over. We are skipping all of this, and I'll just finish with 2 slides on poems about German forms of address. And I particularly like Yoko Tawada's poems in her collection Die Abenteuer der deutschen Grammatik, So Yokotawada coming from a much more complex system of form of address, where you also change how you call yourself in Japanese if you change how you call somebody else. So the changeover from a formal form of address to an informal would be also changing the first person singular, which is unchangeable in German or in all of the Germanic languages as far as I know. So she talks about die zweite Person, ich. Als ich dich noch siezte, sagte ich und meinte damit mich. Seit gestern duze ich dich, weiß aber noch nicht, wie ich mich umbenennen soll. So I think it's quite good at capturing this, also the insecurity of status transition when changing between different forms of address. And I finish with a summary, which is slightly outdated now, from 1980, of whom to use the informal form of address for. Man duzt sich unter sich, man duzt sich auf dem Strich. Strich is the public who's, how do you call that? Red light district. One says you in this form of intermediation, man duzt sich bei der Liebe. Es duzen sich die Diebe, Schauspieler, Diplomaten, die Maurer, Totengräber, die Soldaten. Man duzt sich im Milieu und in der SPD. Milieu is a funny spelling for the kind of working class environment. So among working class you use within the in-group the Du, and the SPD as with its socialist roots also uses the Bruder Du. Man duzt auch alle Kinder, der Pfarrer duzt den Sünder, man duzt den lieben Gott und jeden, wenn er tot. So in a funeral address you would address the dead person with a second person singular. Man duzt sich nach dem 12. Bier und du sagst besser sie zu mir. All right, over to Howard.
Great. I thought we'd have a bit of audience participation.
Good, yeah.
Have you got the handout? Yeah.
So, do you want to have the
You
handout?
on the screen if you like, yeah.
Yeah.
Have you got it?
Yeah.
Okay.